This is session 2 of our course. It's called Cultural Icebergs, Hot and Cold. And in this session, you'll see if you pull up your PowerPoint for session 2, we're going to talk about what is culture and what are the main differences between culture and what difference does that make? Why does it even matter? So, first of all, if you go to the first slide of your PowerPoint, you will see a few statements about culture. Culture is like a decoder ring. So I don't know if any of you remember the movie The Christmas Story, but in that movie, the little boy who is the main character, he gets really excited because he has gotten a little Orphan Annie decoder ring in the mail. He's worked long and hard, collected his UPC symbols from his cereal boxes or his Ovaltine boxes. He sent them in, and he got the decoder ring, and he's listening to this radio show. It was before TV, or right when TV first came in. And he's listening to the radio show, and it says, "Okay, secret agents, get out. If you have your decoder ring, you're part of Orphan Annie's special secret circle. So get out your decoder rings, we're going to give you the secret code." And so he gets so excited and he writes down the code, a series of numbers, and then he goes into the bathroom, the only place where he can get some privacy, and he has his ring and he starts decoding it, and he gets "be sure to," and he's like, what is Annie going to tell me? What's so important? He thinks he's going to have some sort of message to save the world. And as he translates his decoder ring, the rest of it is "be sure to drink your Ovaltine." And the poor kid, he said, "What is this? It's not a secret spy message, it's just a crummy commercial." And so his decoder ring ended up disappointing him. But actually that decoder ring tells you a lot about American culture, right? Everything's a crummy commercial. We're a very consumeristic culture. Well, culture and the way that you decode the meaning of life, sort of like the way that he decoded his special secret message that he got off the radio. He used that decoder ring. A more scholarly definition of culture is that it's the fabric of meaning in terms of which human beings interpret their experience and guide their actions. Another analogy of culture is that it is like an iceberg, in that you can see the tip of it, but there is a whole lot beneath the surface that you don't see. On that same slide, you see the cultural iceberg diagram, and it shows you the kinds of things that you see on the surface. For instance, music, food, art, the way people dress, the way they dance, even language is on the surface. We all recognize that different cultures speak different languages. However, look at all the really important things that are under the surface. There is also a lot of language that is underneath the surface of culture. For example, like cultural allusions. If you talk about Romeo and Juliet at her balcony, then Americans and British people and most Europeans would know that that's a romantic image. But people from another culture who'd never had experience in Shakespeare might have no idea what that means. So there's a lot about language that's below the surface of culture. It's not something that you can identify just on top of the surface. Things like social interaction, communication, time, one's relationship to nature. You see the list of very important things that are underneath the surface of that iceberg. And of course, just like with Titanic, we know that the part of the iceberg that's the most dangerous is not the part that you can see, but the part that you can't see. That is what can hit you without warning and take you down. So by studying culture, you study not only the parts you can see, but hopefully you study and learn how to interpret the things that you can't see and to be prepared for those so you don't end up like Titanic. Go ahead and go to the next slide, and we see that the elements of culture, especially the ones below the surface, can be interpreted as existing along continuums. So one book that we use a lot in this class, Lingenfelter and Myers, Ministering Cross-Culturally, And in this book, he defines several continuums, including time orientation versus event orientation, task versus person, dichotomistic thinking versus holistic thinking, status focus versus achievement focus, crisis orientation versus non-crisis orientation. Where a culture falls on these continua makes a big difference in terms of how they make decisions, how they live life, how they communicate. And if you find yourself on the opposite end of a continuum than someone else, you could have a lot of conflict, especially if you don't understand what is causing these differences. If you don't understand in the back of your head, this is because we're on the opposite ends of a continuum, and instead you think this is just because this person is not as smart as me, or this person is stubborn, something like that. So we're going to talk about these continuums so that we can make more educated judgments about the people that we work with, and especially our students in this context, based on where they fall on these different cultural continua. So go ahead and move to time versus event orientation on the next slide. Time-oriented people, as you can guess, they are run by their watch. Time. They're very punctual. They have a clock in every room. Usually things happen fast. They have a lot of things on their schedule. Boom, appointments. And they might look at people who are not on their end of the spectrum and say that those people who are late or slow, I think those people are lazy, or they have a laissez-faire attitude. They're not with it, and they're not together. Event-oriented people are on the other end of the spectrum, and these people are more focused on what happens during an event rather than the time that it begins and ends. So, for example, they might, during an event, show up at any time. They might be a few minutes late, but they will stay as long as it takes to get things done, and they don't just want to get things done within a time frame, but they want to reach a consensus amongst everyone involved. They want to be sure that the relationships of the people at the event are preserved. And they see people who are time-oriented on the other end of the spectrum as being very uptight and rigid, especially about their time. So, time-oriented people value efficiency, and event-oriented people value consensus. And if you look at the chart at the bottom of the slide, you see that Americans tend to be more time-oriented, whereas people in South Pacific cultures tend to be way on the other end of the spectrum. You'll notice that Korean people, according to this chart and according to Lingenfelter and Myers, are quite balanced. They kind of are on a 4 and a 5 between time and event. Whereas, so they have a lot of time value, but ultimately the event and the relationships of the people at the event are also important. So a good story, this is on the next slide, but I'll just tell you, was when I lived in Peru. I lived with a Peruvian family for 4 months, and while I was there, we attended a wedding. And one of my host brothers, who was only 6, he was a very cute little boy named Giancarlo, he had been invited to be the ring bearer in the wedding. And so I was told that the wedding was at 4 o'clock, and our whole family was going together. I was kind of surprised when lunch wasn't earlier that day. We normally had lunch around 2, but that day I think it was even a little bit late, and that lunch wasn't on the table till 2:30. And we were across the town from the church where the wedding was. And so we were eating, and I was kind of hurrying, and everyone else was just taking their time. And I was thinking in the back of my head, wow, they really are pretty relaxed considering we have to be at a wedding pretty soon. And I started getting more and more nervous, and more nervous. And they were very relaxed. I kind of pushed them. I was like, we need to be there. The wedding's at 4. The wedding's at 4. Finally, I pushed them out the door at about 3:45. On the way, we had to stop and get gas and get a soda to contribute to the wedding reception. And I was like, I cannot believe this. Their little boy is in the wedding and they're going to show up late. This is crazy. How rude and how ridiculous. Well, we got to the wedding, to the church at 4:15. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a disaster. But they, curiously, my Peruvian family, were not fazed. And sure enough, when we walked into the church, there was like 3 other people there. Hardly anyone was there. And the bride and the groom and the wedding party were nowhere in sight. And it wasn't because the wedding had come and gone, but because it had not even begun. And no one had showed up. And so at 4:15, no one was there for the 4 o'clock wedding, and my Peruvian family looked at me and said, see, why were you so uptight? What's the problem? And so finally the bride got there about 5, and they had a lovely 4 o'clock wedding at 5:30 that evening, and everything came off perfectly. So I discovered that my Peruvian family and the Peruvians in general are very event-oriented, which surprised me in my time-oriented American background. Okay, so the next slide is dichotomistic thinking versus holistic thinking. Now, dichotomistic thinkers tend to compartmentalize issues, put them in boxes, okay? We reduce things to black and white, true and false. We tend to be systematic, and we have specific roles, and we keep things in those boxes according to our roles. And we tend to keep things disconnected. Our work life is different from our home life. Those things don't necessarily integrate too much. And if they do, sometimes we're worried that it would be a conflict of interest, okay, because we normally keep things separate. Holistic thinkers, on the other hand, see everything as part of a larger context, and they see the whole, and they make decisions in a nuanced way. Whenever they make work decisions, they consider how that affects their lives or the lives of their coworkers. Their thinking may not appear as organized to dichotomistic thinkers. Instead, everything is interconnected, and relationships and the network of relationships is very important, and everything is connected to everything. So my favorite analogy or example of this is actually a very funny video, which I'm going to have you watch right now. So you're going to pause me and go onto Moodle and click the link for men's brains versus women's brains, where the comedian and teacher Mark Gungor gives his interpretation of how men are more dichotomistic in their thinking and women are more holistic in their thinking.